Well, welcome back to Birken Livestream Q&A. And let us proceed with first questions from all over the world.
Ajahn, our first question from the live chat is from Terry. Dear Ajahn, I become very discouraged when I become hooked by powerful negative emotions. It seems like most of the time I'm, quote, doing okay, having neutral or slight positive or negative emotions, but not being swept up by them. When I feel more doom and gloom, I'm very disappointed that my practice isn't strong enough to ride through the emotional storm with more detachment and faith. It makes me question if my practice is heading in the right direction. Any advice? Is there happiness free of suffering to be had in this life before reaching Nibbana?
Yes, so two parts of the question. One is happiness possible before Nibbana? And the other one is, what is a technique for interrupting heavy negative emotions? So let's do the first part first. And one way to interrupt when you're swept away like that and you can't just dismiss it. So there is a technique that the Buddha talks about. And he makes a simile. A man is running and he thinks, why am I running? Why don't I walk? So then he walks. Why am I walking? Why don't I sit down? So then he sits. Why am I sitting? Why don't I lie down? So then he lies down. And this is a simile for bringing these hard, heavy emotional states down in stages. And so you can't just be running and then suddenly lie down. You're going to have to somehow bring it down to walk, to sit, to lie down. So that is... Now, the Buddha doesn't give anything specific in that simile about how to do it, but in many other places he gives all kinds of strategies and techniques for winding down these things. And let's say that one very good way is to let the voice of another bring you out of your inner dialogue, your inner monologue, which is telling you how dark and problematic the world is. So that problem that you are experiencing, you could be talked out of it. And you've talked yourself into it. And it may not seem to you that you have, but because you have invested a lot of habit energy into talking yourself into deep, dark emotions, you do it very easily, effortlessly. So you might even think that it just happens to you, but it doesn't just happen. It has a causal component to it. So you got to use a causal component in the other direction to overcome that. And eventually, when you're saturated with another view of reality, the dark, difficult emotions will disappear because you can't hold two opposite emotions at the same time. So the Buddha gives this as called replacement. Now, the replacement happens in a gradual way. So one technique is to get a talk going, put your earphones on, and let somebody describe the nature, the Dhamma. And the Dhamma for that particular type of situation would be that, as the Buddha says, all these tragedies and bad things in the world and so forth are just the nature of reality. It is so. And the Buddha would use the phrase, just so, wars and terrible starvation and illnesses and bad weather and failures, all of this says, just so, such things happen. And we don't argue with those things, but we don't let them determine how we feel. So this kind of thing is always going on somewhere on the planet, somewhere in the universe. Terrible tragedies are happening all the time. If you think that you should respond to these things with negative emotion, then you should be in profound depression and sadness all the time. Because there's always something horrific going on. But are you? No, you're not. Because sometimes your mind is on something else. It's on some positive thing and so forth. So actually, you're not completely determined by the events of the world. You're determined by what you focus on. But if you could focus on the fact that your emotions are really not determined by the events of the world at all, that you are choosing to react in a certain way, then you realize you're free to change your mind and change your emotions. And you might as well tune out of the negative situation. Now, why should you do that? Are you just burying your head in the sand and refusing to see it? Are you looking through rose-colored glasses? No, not at all. You are using a strategy and a philosophy of life, and that is that you're in this world where inevitably illness, aging, death, loss, massive calamities all happen, and you have a choice about how you're going to feel in the midst of this. And most people are always convinced that they should be swept away in sympathetic grieving and anger, etc., with things they disagree with, and that's just a bad strategy. That's the attitude of people who are not very wise. Now, either you go with that or you go with the strategies of people who are wise, and those who are wise say, this is the nature of reality, but you have a choice about how you feel. And it's not because of that everything is going well that you're happy. If you can manage to stop harassing your own mind and not being preoccupied with these events, then the mind will return to a state of buoyancy, light, and well-being. And that's the answer to this other part of your question. Can you experience this happiness before the attaining Nibbana? Yes, indeed. And the Buddha talks about temporary Nibbana. Isn't that a strange thing for the Buddha to talk about? Temporary Nibbana. Temporary Nibbana is just relief, temporary relief, which, unless you're fully enlightened, you're only going to have temporary relief from time to time. But temporary relief is wonderful, and it's quite addictive as well. The better you feel, the more you want to feel better. And you will learn the trick of how to feel well in the midst of this chaotic world that we live in. And once you do that, you'll learn the trick. You'll learn the trick how to do it. It's magic. It's the magic of the mind. It is the best trick possible for a human to learn. And the better you get at it, the more often and frequent and long-lasting your experience of lightness, buoyancy, and well-being is. And that conduces to finally arriving at this state of Nibbana. And by the way, I want to just, for everybody, Nibbana is an easy description of it is the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion, and the presence of non-greed, non-hatred, and delusion, which in the positive form is a generous, kindly, and lucid state of being, which is no other than happiness, a very profound and grand type of well-being and happiness. And that is the human experience of Nibbana. Nibbana is not a place, it's not another planet or some sort of physical description of the universe or some other dimension which is independent of human experience. The only possible meaningful interpretation of Nibbana is something that a human can experience through a way of seeing reality. And so that's how one should define it. And there are many words that define this word Nibbana, or in contemporary Sanskrit language, nirvana. I think that nirvana is in the Oxford English Dictionary now. And it's a profound well-being and happiness. From the point of view of the Buddha, it's unshakable, irreversible and unshakable, Before you get to the unshakable part, though, you can get tastes of it, little tastes of well-being and happiness. So there you are. Let's go on to the next question, Pia.
Our next question is from the live chat from Cynthia in Ontario, Canada. Ajahn Sona, is non-self nothing more than a lack of attachment to identity, since everything we are is by haphazard? What we are born into and conditioning and whatnot?
Well, non-self is, the problem is, like, before we talk about non-self, let's talk about self. People use this term all the time, yourself, myself, my soul, my this, my that. What do you mean? So what the Buddha is saying about non-self is he's at the time of the Buddha, various religious and philosophical thinkers had to contemplate what is the self, what is the nature of the self, the soul, the Atman. Atman is a Sanskrit term, Atman, and they came up with various definitions because they had to deal with this idea which permeated most of Indian thought at the time, and in fact, by the way, permeated most of the Greek thought at the time as well, and that is that one reincarnates, one existed before this life, came into this life, will pass through this life and into another life, and this is called the cycle, the samsaric cycle. Well, what is it that came into this life? What's the essence of who you are, and what will go on to the next life? What is that? What is the thing? Because obviously your body doesn't. It just falls on the ground. What is it? What is it that goes on? So this was a perplexing problem and made it very problematic to actually get out of this endless cycle of birth and death, which they didn't regard as a very desirable condition to remain in, because it's fraught with all kinds of tragedies and problems, and it always ends in death and then starts again in a new birth. This was a big problem for a lot of people in the West, because we don't have usually that theory. When they hear about rebirth or reincarnation, they often say, oh, goody, I get to have another life. I get to have a whole bunch of lives. I think next time I want to more ice cream and red convertibles, etc. But the Indian attitude and the Greek philosophical attitude. So remember these famous people, Plato and Socrates, so forth. They also held this view of reincarnation and samsara. It's often overlooked when you hear about philosophers, Greek philosophers, that they held the same view. Their mission was to get out of this. So before you start talking about non-self and no self, you have to get clear what is meant by self and what do you think your self is. So all these thinkers had to say, well, a self is this indestructible thing that can survive death and jumps into another body. Now, however difficult that is to imagine, but that's one of the definitions of a soul as well. Even in Christianity, in the early philosophical schools, they had to define what a soul was, and it's like indestructible monad, something or other. Well, the Buddha is saying, no, there's nothing like that. That's an impossible concept. There's no thing, like a little steel ball bearing that is indestructible, titanium ball bearing that it jumps from one body to another. No. Oh, so everybody was disturbed by that. They said, oh, you're a nihilist. You think that when you die, that's it. It's over. And by the way, there were philosophers contemporary with the Buddha who very distinctly and clearly and insistently taught that very doctrine. This is the doctrine, a very common doctrine these days. What are you talking about? soul and next life and all that kind of stuff. Nothing like that happens. You just come to the end of your life and it's over. It's dead. You're dead. Nothing. So that is a disturbing new idea in Western society. It's been around for 150 years and has upset quite a few people and demoralized a lot of people. And you have this thing called nihilism, annihilationism, and so forth. Is when you're confronted with a life that just ends in nothing, you think, well, it's all absurd. It's meaningless. No, good and bad don't have any consequences. There are no rewards or punishments. It's all just random, absurd. And some people take that as a freedom. Some people take that as a kind of a nauseating idea. Like you get dizzy and seasick from the idea of meaningless, absurd existence which ends in nothing. So this is the disturbance that has come into the West. And it's around the nature of this dispute about the self. Does the self persist? Does it not? And if it persists, in what way? So the Buddha says, I distinguish between two errors. One is the self is real, and it is a indestructible titanium ball bearing that jumps out of one body and into the next. And then the alternative mistake is when you die, that's it. Nothing happens. No one goes anywhere. Nothing goes anywhere. He says, I don't accept either of those alternatives. I teach a middle path between those two extremes. And that is that there is, in fact, no what we would call real self. There is no titanium ball bearing. And it is not correct to say that when you die, all that you are perishes. Neither of those is the case. So he introduces a new concept, very hard to grasp, especially at the time, a little bit perhaps easier now. And that is that all of what you are is not an are, it's a flux. You are a verb, not a noun. And not all of the verb perishes at death. Aspects of this stream of being, the stream of consciousness, the stream of feelings, the stream of perceptions, the stream of memories, the stream of the body is a stream, not a thing. The stream, part of the stream persists and flows out of this life into the next. And so that is, he's saying there is no noun self, no titanium ball-bearing self, but there is a flowing thing, which a flowing process. Now that's a little bit hard for us to grasp. We turn we turn the whole world and the whole universe into jelly or a stream of events. And it's a little hard to get your mind around it because we think of ourselves as a personality that travels through time, but we don't. We are just a stream flowing in time. That's all. So that's what's meant by self and non-self. So if that helps you, and by the way, this is not just a philosophy. This is not just a curious and interesting idea like quantum physics or something like this. No. This should change the way you feel about everything. If you really understood this, you would suffer less. And if you understood it fully, you would not suffer at all. Because suffering arises from the misunderstanding about reality as things versus flow. Steel ball bearings versus streams. And when you get rid of all of the little solid things, you get in touch with reality. And reality is flow, anicca, or impermanence, and lack of substance. Anatta, or no self, means is another word for no substance, no solid personality center. There are traits that are recognizable one moment to the next. But just as in this life, we change drastically from being a tiny fetus to being an old person, and yet there are certain patterns that are recognizable, your fingerprints and so forth. But by the way, your fingerprints change in size all the time. So, and they, of course, that which makes up your fingerprint is skin, which is falling off all the time as well. So there are patterns in the stream, that's all. Yes. Well, we've taken quite a bit of time on this, but it's a very important topic, so let's move on to the next question.
Next question from the live chat is from Echinoderm. It is said that a tadpole only understands properly what water is once it grows up to be a frog and experiences land. The same way a person only properly understands sensuality once they frequently experience the jhanas. Can you elaborate on how one's outlook on sensuality changes experientially? How do they feel about sensuality, and in what way would they feel repulsed by it?
Well, that's a nice simile, and it does occur in Buddhist teachings, and it's usually so that simile is the tadpole, the frog, and the fish. So tadpoles are swimming around. Of course, I hope everybody knows what a tadpole is. And if you don't, look it up. Google it. So I'm not going to explain. Well, let's not divert into biology here. So a tadpole swims around underwater all the time with the fishies. And they're friends, right? But the tadpole eventually turns into a frog, and one day, frog jumps out of the water onto land and hops around. Marvelous experience because of the transformation from a tadpole to a frog. But the frog can go back into the water. So the frog goes back to see his old buddies, the fish. And he says to the fish say, "Where were you anyway? You disappeared on us." I said, "Well, I was up on land." And the fish say, "Land? What are you talking about?" The frog goes into great detail about what land is and this and that's solid and you can jump around and it's just, and the fish say, "You're just imagining things. Come on." There's no such thing. We've never in all our experience had any sort of notion of that. That's ridiculous. The frog says, sorry, it's an experience. I mean, I don't have a lot of words for it, and I can't seem to communicate it to you, but there is such a thing as land. So that's usually used as a simile for a nibbana or nirvana, that the attempt to express enlightened perceptions, enlightened ideas, and what it does to you is falls on deaf ears. But you could use it also between the sensory world. So most people find their happiness in sights and sounds, smells and tastes and touches and ideas. So you listen to music, and then you go to dinner, and then you go see your friends, and then you have a romantic escapade, and then you get in a car and you whiz through the town, and you this is your idea of happiness. Then you get a great philosophical idea or a clever joke or something like this. So this is the sensory happiness, the world of sensory happiness. And then some few people are talking about this other type of experience, which is non-sensory. And they say, well, I watch my breath. I focus on my nose. Well, this becomes a pejorative story, a dismissive story in contemplating your navel. So I think this came from the British when they were in India. They found sadhus that were apparently in some sort of trance, and they were apparently contemplating their navel. That's not what they were contemplating, but they couldn't understand it. They were ordinary blokes that had come in and taken over a whole empire which had a spiritual tradition. And there were a bunch of strange fellows in there that didn't seem to participate in normal reality and seemed to be very well off and had great well-being and happiness. But this was highly suspicious to the ordinary person because, after all, what else is there than the sensory world of well-being and happiness? This is where it's all happening. Shouldn't you stop meditating and get out there and help orphans or something? Do something social or go to a party? I mean, it's annoying that you somehow find satisfaction in watching your breath. Well, of course, watching your breath is not what the person is doing. They're maybe using the breath as a method for entering into this special state of consciousness, which is quite hard to describe to a person who has never experienced that realm. So the person in the sensory realm is like the fish, and the tadpole is a person who is also in the sensory realm, but they graduate into the frog. They what do we say, transform into a frog. And then they experience something outside of the sensory world. And then quite often they try to express this to people who have never been out of the sensory world. So those are the fish. And the fish just have a perplexed. Sometimes they even get very mad at you. When you talk about this, they just say you're lying. This can't be. Oh, that didn't happen. Come on, that can't happen. So that's the simile of the fish, the tadpole, the frog, etc. That it can work in many ways. I want to focus a little bit also on the nature of this weird transformation from a tadpole into a frog. And please go on YouTube and watch it happen. Not while you're... Stay on my channel for now. Don't go watching tadpoles. Stay with me now. But what is it? What is it that turns into a frog? And by the way, is there a tadpole inside the frog? Or is there just a tadpole and then a frog? And what's the relationship between a tadpole and a frog? It's all flow, isn't it? There isn't a frog or a tadpole, there's just processes. And so this is what is also meant by the Buddhist concept of no self. Between lives, you turn from one human into another human through processes, but your self, this self doesn't go into the next self. The tadpole doesn't go into the frog. So this is the problem of identity under change. Reflect on that phrase a lot. What is identity when everything is changing? How do you express that? Identity means identical one moment to the next. Identical one moment to the next. That which does not change is identical. And when we look for something that is identical one moment to the next, we can't find any. Nothing's identical one moment to the next. Not even atoms. They're all just flowing processes. So let's get out of the pond and back to the questions here.
Our next question is from Karnatik from the Bay Area, California. Dear Ajahn Sona and team, just a question about the practice of music and Micha Samadhi. As a hopeful meditator, is practicing music counterproductive to attaining jhana? I am a music teacher.
Yeah, well, I used to be a music teacher too. So that's the first half of my life was being a musician. Well, not exactly. I guess I wasn't a musician when I was 2. But when I was starting at maybe 4 or 5, playing piano and stuff. Yeah, so, I end up as a musician. I ended up with a master's degree in classical music and so forth, and I made a living as playing and teaching and so forth. And so I understand your dilemma. And I began to meditate. Now, it's not the case that if you play music or teach music, etc., that you are disqualified from ever attaining samadhi. And by the way, Carnatic is his name? Carnatic.
Yes, Carnatic.
So he, I presume he, used a couple of terms I want to explain, and there was miccha, M-I-C-C-H-A, samadhi, and that means wrong concentration. Music is wrong concentration. So is the Buddha saying music is a bad thing? You bad boy, you listen to music, you play music. No, you're not a bad boy for doing that. In fact, it's very interesting. Music and what the effect on some people of music, both either playing it or listening to it, puts you into a state of, and I'm sure a lot of the people who are listening to me agree with this, not everybody, but many, a state of ease and joy, a whole sweeping, emotions sweep over you. And for a timeless period, you are flowing with the music. It might even your bodily discomforts, your pain and your arthritis and so forth is like you forget about it for a while. You forget about your troubles, your worries. It calms the savage breast. Music hath charms to soothe the savage breast. Or beast. Is it breast or beast? Beast. Okay. Yes. So, so this is the magic of music. Now, this is not bad. Problem is, the music has to stop sometime, and then the magic goes away. And you need the music to get into the magic. So the Buddha is suggesting that you can get into the magic, the same kind of beautiful experience, without the music. So if you have played the guitar with 6 strings, you can learn to play the guitar with no strings attached. So that's what sama samadhi, right samadhi, right delicious immersion in concentration is the music where there are no notes. Can you play the music without the notes? Can you play the music without the strings? No strings attached? That's the music. So that's various traditions, including Taoism, talk about that. I play the flute with no sound. I play the lute with no strings. Can you hear the music of the lute with no strings? The flute with no breath, no sound. Another type of it's even better than music. So keep the best experiences that you've ever had with music as a model for the emotional experience of samadhi, or what we call jhana. This is more of a specific term for types, stages or levels of this samadhi. Samadhi is the 8th factor of the Eightfold Path, and it's called samma samadhi. So to distinguish it from worldly samadhi, the beautiful sensory experiences they got problems to them, and the problems are that they don't last, and you have to be dependent on certain situations external to you, etc. So can we still have fun? Can we still have a delicious experience that is not subject so much to external dependency, the dependency on sound and sight and smells and tastes and touches? By the way, like poor Beethoven, great genius composer, but he went deaf. You can imagine that, eh? What if your entire life is shaped around this music and the sound, and you stop being able to hear? What a huge tragedy. I read a while back about a chef, sort of a Michelin star chef who had got cancer of the tongue, so he couldn't taste anything anymore. Like this is the problematic nature of depending on these things for your happiness. What happens if the rug's pulled out from under you? So this samadhi has a beautiful, rich, wonderful experience, but it also assists in clarifying the mind so that supernormal wisdom can arise out of it, right? So you get another benefit. Not only is it pleasant here and now, a wonderful experience, a place to abide here and now, but it also has something that naturally rises and swells out of it, out of samadhi, the right samadhi. Wisdom naturally rises and swells, so says the Buddha. Now, I won't go on too long about this, but there's an answer.
Next question is from Dinko in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Dear Ajahn Sona, what are the main distinctions between Ajahn Chah Thai forest tradition and some other forest traditions?
You know, none of these forest traditions have like a specific technique. They're not technique schools. There is no Thai forest tradition meditation technique. There's a bunch of monks who dwell in the forest, as the Buddha advised. I would say their primary connection, their primary sense of identity is because they are quite meticulous in the following of the Vinaya. The Vinaya are the rules of conduct for monks. So it's a reform movement because monks in general, in many of the Buddhist countries in recent times and in older times as well, were not all that well disciplined and did not adhere to the rules of conduct which the Buddha laid down in a very careful and explicit way, and wanted people to follow these rules for the sake of Dhamma. This is a support to Dhamma. So that is probably the most common quality. The other aspect is perhaps taking up some somewhat extra ascetic practices. A lot of perhaps meditative practices, one meal a day, this kind of allowable ascetic practices. And these are not necessary practices. Every monk who ordains does not have to take these practices up, but these are called allowable practices. And the forest tradition tends to encourage these things, sometimes rather insist on them if you want to be a monk in those monasteries. So it's an ascetic practice. It's very carefully meticulous about the rules of conduct. And by the way, that is actually a practice of mindfulness, because you have to learn and internalize these very precise rules and until they're second nature. And this requires a lot of awareness and retention of awareness of your behavior and memory of what the rules are. So that's the kind of the atmosphere of those monasteries, and they frequently share they're quite similar in that way. But the individual monks quite often teach all kinds of different approaches to meditation and Dhamma, etc. So it's not like there are schools called like Vipassana schools, primarily from Burma, where it's a meditation technique, and the secondary aspects are whatever the behavior, but the forest traditions tend to be identifiable by their emphasis on Vinaya, asceticism, but not necessarily any exact method or technique. As with the Buddha, you will see that the Buddha doesn't teach single techniques. There is no silver bullet, a technique that works for everybody. Otherwise, the Buddha would have used it and said, there's only one technique, this is it. Instead, he taught quite a substantial variety of techniques depending on individual personalities, etc. So I think it's closer to the nature of the teachings of the Buddha, where a teacher will evaluate students and give them particular exercises, practices for their individual personality, what would benefit them the most, what they need the most, etc. So that's kind of to articulate that, yeah.
Next question is from Brian in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Can you comment on a Buddhist view on aliens? Do you think that the Buddha's description of devas can tell us something about the ETs?
Well, perhaps the devas are the ETs, and the ETs are the devas. Who knows? Actually, when you talk, like in Thailand, especially amongst practitioners of Buddhism and who are more or less born and raised in a cosmology that describes the universe as just packed with all kinds of interdimensional beings from different dimensions appearing and disappearing, interacting occasionally with the human realm. When you bring that the idea of UFOs or aliens, etc., into that, they don't even blink. I mean, it's like, and what is this, news to you or something? So the entire history of Buddhism is just chock-a-block with interactions with other beings from other dimensions. And not everybody has these interactions. Some people are hypersensitive to it. They have them every day, and they're conversing, they're friends with them, they're harassed by them, all kinds. The Buddha himself is endlessly talking about interactions with other beings from different dimensions, possibly different planets. The Buddha describes a vast universe with incalculable numbers of inhabited world systems. And beyond that, what we would call maybe the multiverse, the other dimensional other dimensional universes where they're not apparent to the ordinary senses, but so this whole thing is completely saturated in Buddhism. It's completely saturated. Now, as Buddhism came to the West, all of that got dropped, and everybody went to a sterile environment with a silent mindfulness retreat with no cosmology. Do not mention other beings, other dimensions, and don't mention sometimes morality either. Don't alienate your audience, and your audience is there primarily for a little psychotherapy, a little mindfulness, a little bit, learn how to pay attention a little bit, but don't bring up religious ideas. And so there's this idea, this is what, in some ways, certain types of Buddhism was sold as a kind of a material philosophy with a cool psychology attached. And very deliberately, the strange, wonderful, interdimensional aspects were dehydrated and removed, burnt off, not mentioned. So if you want to explore these things, if you're actually an adult, if you're actually growing up and want to actually hear what the Buddha actually said, go to my cosmology videos, 10 cosmology videos I did with Ajahn Dhamma. And we explain the incredible multiple richness of the universe that is the cosmology that the Buddha and at the time lived in, and which is considered, just, you can't mention these things to people in the West because there's something wrong with their heads, and they can't imagine that there's anything except this blank materiality that they see with their eyes in front of them. This is because of a revolution that happened in the West, a materialist revolution, and a century and a half ago, and it was the dismissing of Christianity and all of its cosmology and all the religiosity and everything. Everybody now wants to be a little spiritual, but not religious, or not even spiritual, but just a little less neurotic and tortured. And maybe mindfulness will help. So that's the attitude. But as far as interest in visits from aliens and so forth, we have one interest, that is, they'll suffer too. I guarantee you, the aliens visiting you will not be. They'll suffer, as do the descriptions of the devas, the angelic beings and so forth. They are all subject to suffering as well. They're actually visiting to get some advice from the Buddha quite often. So all beings in the universe who are alive, functioning, and conscious have some exposure to suffering, and that's the primary interest of Buddhism. Is there is suffering, and the question is there a way out of it? Yes, there is. So whether you're from Mars or alien from another universe or whatever it is, you got the same problem as humans do. We all have the same problem, and that is the problem is existence itself. Yeah. So that's our preoccupation. We don't really care about all this stuff. It's not really on the top of our agenda. It's just a rich way of looking at the universe, but it's not the main thing. But those of you who have not had more or less mind-opening experiences about this, should consider maybe it's quite for a more layered universe to burst into your awareness and consciousness is quite an experience, quite an enriching experience as well. So anyway, that's it for that.
Our next question is from Anonymous in Western Australia. Dear Ajahn Sona, is there an explanation as to why some people acquire psychic abilities along with their spiritual development? Should they be used?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion of this, and sometimes even Buddhist schools, and especially sort of secular Buddhist schools, some of the Zen schools and stuff are quite dismissive of the psychic side effects of meditation. The Buddha did not at all dismiss these. Now, these are not the center of it. So you'll get often in folk Buddhist cultures, folk Buddhist culture, they seem to think that an enlightened monk or enlightened person, the sign of the enlightened person is that they have incredible abilities to read your mind or fly through the air or see the future or something like this. They quite often confuse like magical powers with enlightenment, but these two are two different things. Enlightenment may not be accompanied by the slightest supernormal psychic capacity, reading other people's minds or seeing the future or seeing into other dimensions or flying through the air or whatever, all kinds of magical kind of powers. It may not be the slightest connection to the liberation from suffering. However, it can be. And by the way, these psychic, marvelous, sort of strange, supernormal capacities can be also had by people who are not enlightened at all. So you can have this capacity. But this happens, in order to understand these things, is that we see all kinds of people that have supernormal capacities that we can't. There are autistic savants who have an absolute, complete memory of any piece of music that they hear even once and can reproduce it. And this can be a very sophisticated classical piano sonata or something like this. And they can reproduce this thing note by note on a single hearing, because they have what's called absolute pitch, which is also a supernormal kind of capacity, but only 1 in 10,000 people have this. There are people who have synesthesia, which is that they see notes appear to them as colors, and sounds appear to them as shapes. And so the synesthesia, the crossing of the senses. Now, for most people, you don't see green when you play D flat, but some people do, and it's super normal. It's hard to understand, and some people have an absolute memory. In other words, they can recall every hour of their life precisely and exactly, and everything in the environment. Everything from the age of 2 on is completely available to their memory. Now, I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but so I'm sure a few of you are like that as well. So supernormal memories, fantastic sensitivity to others' emotions. Some people are just have no ability to intuit anybody else's emotions, and some people are just hypersensitive to it. See, these are supernormal, extraordinary capacities, and this occurs in the spiritual world as well. However, it is not essential to enlightenment. So that's the relationship between these two things. But they're interesting to know about, and they're fully described by the Buddha, very articulated again and again and again. The Buddha calls them ornaments. So this monk, so forth, is an arahant, a fully enlightened monk, and he also has the capacity to remember multiple past lives. He has the capacity to see into other world systems, dimensions. He has the supernormal ear. He can hear what's going on in the heavens. He can see. He has the Diba Chaku, the eye that sees into heavens. So he talks about numbers of his monk disciples who have stages of enlightenment and also have supernormal capacities. And he also talks about people who have supernormal capacities but are not enlightened. So these things are not identical, but they're fascinating. I mean, you deprive yourself if you stick to a kind of a dried out materialist mindfulness practice. You deprive yourself of some amazing, rich experience of a whole different culture and view of reality and view of the possibilities of the mind that is available in the Pali Canon, the large collection of the teachings of the Buddha. The Pali Canon, by the way, is available on. You can download it off Amazon it's in good translations. Yes, the word of the Buddha is being preserved in a complete extent. And it's an amazing read. So if you're not familiar with this, please do. Yeah. This is it, the last question, yeah.
Okay. Our final question comes from Dujakan in Istanbul, Turkey. There are many different types of Buddhist meditations described in the suttas. As a lay follower, I don't know how to divide my practice time among these meditations. How can I overcome this problem?
Well, you don't have to do everything, and probably almost any of them would be beneficial to you. But here's like the Buddha taught, like for instance, the practice of universal loving kindness it's hard to hurt yourself with that one. Some of the meditations you can sort of mess yourself up a little bit, especially if you're doing it without a teacher. So the ones that are fairly harmless are loving kindness. And you can also do breath meditation, but don't try too hard with it. When you start doing metta is, it's hard to go wrong with the cultivation of loving kindness. Although you can get a little weird. Even with that, you start just being, Don't start hugging people on the street. You get in trouble. Anything, all spiritual practices can make you a little strange. And especially if you're coming out of a kind of a repressed, kind of narrow, self-conscious kind of personality, and you start being introduced to vast, infinite loving kindness to all beings and everything, and it catches on, and you just like, you don't know what to do with this. Like you're experiencing new ways of feeling and being, and you can get a little bit off with that, happens. But just try to practice the loving kindness, but don't be too friendly friendly with people. Try to stay within the bounds of socially accepted behavior. And, listen to a lot of talks on YouTube by me. By the way, there's 10 talks on loving kindness, 10 hours of loving kindness talks by me. So check it out. I will go through every nuance of it, and etc. So that's all I can say for now. And we've come to the end of our hour. So let us finish today, and we will be here next week, perhaps, in the spirit of Buddhism.